Chris Gobber. Welcome to Chris Gobber Art Channel, a YouTube channel for creativity, videos about creativity, my own artwork, culture, film, etc. So today I wanted to talk about the mythos of the tortured artist in popular culture, art culture, and just as an idea in art in general, and what that means to me personally as a painter, artist who also has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, but also broaden it out to discuss some examples of artists who are commonly referred to when people talk about this trope, and also examine if there's any validity to the idea that of the tortured genius or the lone creative, the lone mad artist who lives outside of normal conventions of society, who creates something unique in the process of being an outsider to that society, right? So where do a lot of these ideas of the tortured artist come from, like in terms of art culture in general? The most obvious example, which has been explored a lot as well in popular culture as well, even in the recent history in film and novels, is Van Gogh, Vincent Van Gogh, of course, who himself is believed to have suffered from manic depression, bipolar, and possibly epilepsy as well. I think the rain's quite appropriate. For some reason the weather feels like an appropriate one for this video. So Vincent Van Gogh, obviously a painter, everybody knows the story. Chopped his own ear off, gave it to a prostitute, ended up in Arles and in an asylum at the time, but then at the same time was painting these vivid post-impressionist paintings, flowers, starry night, but deeply suffered from a deeply troubled mind that ultimately, unfortunately, ended up with him taking his own life at the age of 37, I think it was. 38, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. Maybe possibly older, I can't remember exactly what age he took his own life. A tragic story, but then his work survived on, and the mythos, the myth around Vincent Van Gogh became cemented in popular culture of the tortured artist, the visionary artist who creates something new. But then the thing is with Van Gogh, viewing Van Gogh, I'll show some paintings and stuff while I'm talking, but if you look at even in the case of Van Gogh, he was a painter. He did start quite late, but he, like any painter would do, started off by looking at the trends of the day. He was familiar with the Impressionists. He didn't create all his work in isolation. This is a misunderstanding of Van Gogh. He did obviously take it further, painting more in pasto, painting with more vivid colours, but there were a lot of Impressionist painters who he was the contemporary of, and whose work he was aware of, but from being in Paris for a time. And so he didn't exactly create his work in isolation. And this is where I think the myth of the tortured lone genius always gets it wrong. There is some, and I'll go further on in the video. I'll talk a bit more about how there is a degree potentially of truth to it, but it's not. It's a distorted, I think, view of creativity to say that maladaptation, dysfunction, which is what mental illness is by definition, is the actual source of creativity, which I think is, I don't think is particularly a useful idea. But yeah, obviously, like Van Gogh was aware of the trends of his day. He was also, friends with Gauguin, lived with Gauguin for some time. Gauguin was a fairly successful-ish artist at the time, also working in the realms of post-impressionism, and obviously they worked together in the Yellow House for a time. Anyway, go on further to a bit more of a personal exploration of this. So I'm a painter. Paint usually acrylics, but mixed media, sometimes charcoal, pencils, all sorts of pens, a lot of marker pens in the past. I have a diagnosis, formally diagnosed, take medication for bipolar disorder, which is not that uncommon a diagnosis as well, I believe. Like mood disorders in general with fine artists and visual artists, there is quite an overrepresentation, probably it's fair to say, amongst writers and visual artists. Doesn't mean that to produce something that's unique or otherworldly, that you necessarily have to have a mental illness. That would be a ridiculous assertion to make, I think, to be honest. And obviously, like if you look at other examples from, say, musical culture, it can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like Kurt Cobain, for instance, was seen as this tortured, lone voice of the grunge generation. I think he resented a lot of the fame that came his way because of that. He was very uncomfortable with it. Obviously, he came from the punk scene, where authenticity is seen as very important, which it really is. I think it's a value, and I think it really affected him quite badly. Like it almost became destructive. His self-destructive tendencies were not helped by the fame that he gained. But that's a separate conversation, obviously. Keep him on track. So talking about my own. So I think, if anything can be said, obviously you can have a bit of an altered perception. I think if you've ever experienced any sort of mental health symptoms, depending, it could be varying degrees of severity. Obviously, there's a whole form of art called Art Brut, which Buffet wrote quite extensively about, which was him examining the art of the mentally ill under the lens of it being more raw, or being a more raw, truer form of expression, because it's not, this form of expression isn't considering market forces, right? And I think that's the basic premise of why Buffet considered the art of the mentally ill, or so-called art brut or outsider art, as more authentic, because it wasn't considering, is this going to do well on the market? It was just straight from mind to paintbrush down raw expression of, whether it's a visual thing or a map, or an artist like Adolphe Wolfie, for example, was a schizophrenic patient who, but also quite a very violent man. I mean, I think he was imprisoned for, trigger warning here obviously, but for sexual assault basically. So not a particularly nice person, but did produce these bizarre map-like paintings, which are really unlike anything else you could, nothing else really. This is very unique. Same with an artist like Henry Darger, for example. It's a very common outsider artist that's brought up when it comes to discussing outsider art. I don't think it's particularly useful, though, to be honest, to hyper focus on whether an artist has a mental health problem or not. And I think there's probably an argument to be made to say that, if you have a mental health issue like schizophrenia, bipolar, then if the society is healthy, then those problems can be negotiated through. You can take medication, or do workshops, do whatever you need to do, counselling, therapy. Then those illnesses don't become a form of maladaptation to society, because you can control the symptoms of the illnesses with medication or with therapy, or whatever autotherapy, painting, drawing. I think art is a very useful as a therapeutic tool. I think it's obviously nowadays it's been explored much more as a therapeutic tool, whether it's to explore specific traumas or just as general as a distraction from certain disturbing or upsetting symptoms. So I know definitely for myself, I'll just speak for how I relate specifically to this. So I do have a diagnosis of bipolarity. I take Abilify. I've been taking that since I was 19 years old, basically. I had that diagnosis. I'm 37 now, so it's been quite a long time. One thing I've definitely found is that it allows me to channel, because bipolar is actually primarily a problem with energy. It's often described as high and low, but I think it's often better described as slow and fast. The mind processes too fast ahead of itself. Sometimes it goes too slow. Or obviously everyone has a different experience with it, and there's also different forms of it, to be honest too. So you've got bipolar 1, bipolar 2, cyclothymic disorder, etc. So there's different forms of it too, even to make it more complicated. But I found it's been useful having the visual art as a mode of expression. And I probably would be doing it if I didn't have the illness. It's not the illness that's driving that creativity. The creativity is driving the creativity, to not to be too glib about it. I want to express how I feel about the world, how I want to visually express my ideas, and art as a medium to achieve that. Visual art as a medium to achieve that. And in fact, I'd argue even that sometimes having mental health issues can be a drawback. So, for example, with bipolarity or depression, you are not going to be productive when you're depressed. You're practically going to be quite the opposite. Now, people always talk about the high or the fast of in bipolarity, for example, being a very productive period, but it's not focused creativity, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. Having experienced it myself a few times, hypomania or mania, it's not exactly focused, and it's like drawing maps and connections that aren't necessarily, don't really make sense. It can be a bit nonsensical, to be honest, at times. Your mind will start drawing connections where there aren't. And there's hypomania, which can be a more productive, actually creative zone, but then the problem always is, in terms of, like, and I know this from personal experience, is that hypomania can very quickly turn into mania, where it becomes disordered to the point where it just becomes incoherence, actually. And then the expression will also become incoherence, because people's egos are often attached to this manic state when they become, egotistical and, I guess, even egomaniacal, so they don't have any sense of perspective on what they're doing. So someone might think, for example, that what they're producing is an equivalent, just of importance as Van Gogh, which obviously in years it could become and could be, but decades and hundreds, probably many, many decades after you're dead. You know what I mean? So yeah, it just becomes disconnected from the reality of the production, as if that makes sense. So I've talked for quite a while. I want to try and other examples, probably, of artists who definitely suffered with. There are many, obviously, examples of artists who did suffer in one way with depression or anxiety or even ME. I think Frida, Kahlo, who I mentioned in the previous video, probably had something like a fibromyalgia condition, as well as a lot of other health problems. But then, you could argue it was that mental health issues she may have had exacerbated by her physical problems. Probably were. Jackson Pollock, of course, is a good example of a alcoholic problem. He certainly had addiction issues. I think he was in therapy and analysis for a long time for something like schizophrenia or bipolar. I'm pretty sure that's well documented. And himself, of course, very controversial artist in terms of him doing the drip paintings. Not even, particularly accepted in his time. I think he struggled a lot with fame as well. He was quite a troubled man in many respects, but he was sort of thrust into the limelight when his drip paintings became very popular with the general populace, and as popular as art can be in the mass media, especially because he was in Life magazine, right? So, I'll pivot now a bit more onto some of the research that's been done in this area. that I'm aware of anyway. So there is a very good book, which I think I've mentioned a few times before on this channel, about the links between mood disorders and famous writers and musicians. Now there is a link. It doesn't mean that having an illness like this means it's not causation, it's an equal correlation or whatever the phrase is. Doesn't mean that you're better or lesser an artist if you have or don't have one of these conditions. That it's not really the conclusion that this book by K. Redfield Jameson, Fire of the Mind, that's the book I'm thinking about. It's not that it is that it's just that there is those mood disorders are overrepresented if you look into the history of, like, say, famous writers and artists. There is an overrepresentation, like, compared to the general population, say for scientists or administrators or whatever. There is those disorders are overrepresented on some level. Again, it doesn't mean that, and like I said before, it doesn't mean that you have to be mad to make great art, because that, again, this is the mythos of the creative genius, the tortured artist, that they're so tortured by their internal demons that they self-combust. But try living that reality. I mean, it's probably not that fun. Imagine being, okay, for a while, maybe if you become a successful artist, like maybe there was a lot of time when Pollock was probably enjoying what he was doing, but then it sort of quickly turned into despair when he got heavy into drinking again. And with Lee Krasner, he had someone who probably did really care about him, but because of his heavy drinking, just destroyed the fundamental base of their relationship as well. So the thing, like, it's yeah. Ultimately, there is a certain amount of artistic creativity, I think, that comes out of being ill at ease or being outside of society. It does give you, it can be argued that it gives you a unique perspective if you're an outsider in one way or the other. But from the vast majority of artists who also have mental health problems, it's more of a drawback, really, probably, because if you I'm just hypothesizing this, if you have a serious mental health issue, imagine you have schizophrenia, for example, but you're a brilliant artist, a brilliant painter, uniquely talented, have a unique vision, but you have schizophrenia, like serious, like chronic schizophrenia. Do we really think that that's going to help that person to adapt to a world? Because the art world is just like any other world. You have to present your work, you have to be relatively confident, you have to be able to network with people. It's going to obviously present a challenge in some respects, unless you have some sort of intermediary or an agent who can represent you in that level. But most artists don't. Like, most artists don't have access to those sorts of resources. There is like the whole outsider art movement now, which I have mixed feelings about as well. Like, I think at its best, it does, people, underrepresented artists can get more of a clout, as it were, and potentially sell more work and get recognised more. But on the other extreme end of it, it can sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes it can come off as a sort of circus sideshow. Like, oh, this person has X, Y, and Z, and blah blah blah. It can come off as a sort of almost like a zoo type of thing. These people, these weirdos creating this stuff that's outside. But then art's not art, visual art and all that. It's not. It's like, the upper echelons of it. It's just like any other commodity market, really. You're trading commodities, and the art market in some respects can be even worse, because it's trading valued commodities that don't have any intrinsic value beyond the cultural value that we ascribe to them. If that makes sense. So there is a tin of shit in the Tate Museum, for example. Now that has been ascribed cultural value because an artist did it, and it's called artist shit, literally, and put it in a gallery. And now we can argue and debate about the validity of that having cultural value. But the fact is that someone has decided it's got cultural value, so therefore it does now. That's a whole separate thing anyway. I'll probably leave this here because it's only been a 20-minute video, bloody hell. So What do you think? Do you think that there's any truth to the mythos of the tortured artist? What degree of truth do you think it has in validity in terms of it being a valid idea? Have you what's your own personal experience of your mental health and your art? Has it helped? Has it hindered you? Is it, what do you think of the Outsider Art label? Is that one you've ever resented, or is it something you've embraced? You should hear what people's different thoughts on that. For myself, I feel particularly ambivalent, I'd say, towards the outsider art. I wouldn't label myself as an outsider artist. I would say I resent that more than embrace it, to be honest. I don't really want to be treated in a special way because of, having a diagnosable mental illness or anything. It's just, it doesn't really change who I am as a personality. I think it's just an aspect of something I have to manage. That's my honest view on it, really. Anyway, everyone will have different views, so be interested to hear them. Like and subscribe if you like this.